To introduce our first speaker, Florens Greßner from Neurocat. He'll talk about automated risk evaluation and mitigation for AI systems. He is a mathematician by training dedicated to statistics and optimization. And when he was 22, he co-founded Neurocat to help industry assess risk, robustness, and understanding of machine learning systems. It's a pleasure to have you here for our first talk of the day. Welcome.
Here's the clicker. Hi, thanks for the nice introduction. My name is Florens. I'm CEO and co-founder of Neurocat. And for over 5 years now, we focused on assessing the risks of AI systems in safety-critical environments. And we are one of the few startups who really grew organically. So we started, did consulting for several industries and use cases like automotive, telecommunication, and government. And 1 year ago, approximately, we received our first strategic investment from DSpace, and this gives us now the opportunity to take all our knowledge and bring it into our software, and we can now maintain a laser focus on our software solution that should help to automatically evaluate and mitigate risk for safety-critical AI applications. So, I can also put this in my hand. That's very nice. What are we and what do we stand for? So we want to enable trust in AI, but this is not because we are afraid of some singularity or afraid that the AI systems will replace humanity at some point. We know that AI is changing the world, and we saw very nice examples of this and high innovations in this field. But we also saw very, very bad examples, and we believe we can only unleash the full potential of AI if AI is safe and secure and works how it's supposed to be working. And going after this, we support pioneers who want to deploy their AI systems in mission-critical environments and help them to make it such safe and secure. So if you're dealing with safety-critical environments or mission-critical use cases, very quickly you'll get to the point that standardization is very important. And I just picked one example that is quite present currently because the AI Act, the European Commission, published first drafts for a regulation that will come into place very quickly. And this will introduce new use cases that are classified as high risk. So what you're seeing here is a taxonomy, so a risk pyramid they decided on, and they classify different AI applications into unreasonable risk, so anything that is basically against the values of a European citizen. For example, this would be social scoring or different things that are just against our values, and high-risk applications that somehow endanger human dignity or even the human life. And there are also some other low-risk applications that are getting classified, and some applications that have no risk at all, for example, like in the entertainment industry and anything. So what we are wanting to focus on, because there will be regulations and new processes one has to adapt when one is inside these new use cases, I want to just dive into the high-risk applications and what falls into it, and maybe you also are into this and have to adapt to new regulations, standards, and processes you have to implement. So in high-risk applications, the things that are classified by the European Commission is critical infrastructure, so anything that is related to gas and water. So if you want to deploy an AI system for these critical infrastructure use cases, things that are related to scoring and influence the human life, like anything related to education, a credit scoring, or a decision for an employment, so automated decision making, and law enforcement in general, because this also decides for different human lives, and border control and biometrics, because this could also be leading to a lot of discrimination. and anything related to public services in general and general safety components that endanger the life. So anything that is related to high-risk applications and use cases that are trying to deploy AI systems into these fields, currently on the latest draft that is also online, fall under new regulations. And these include that you have to have a systematic risk assessment implemented in a process. You have to have a concept, a systematic concept, that if a failure arises, how do you mitigate this risk, and provide some transparency and interpretability, especially in systems that might lead to discrimination. And there's more points here that I don't go too much into detail in this talk, but this is also mentioned just to give a complete picture here. You also have to implement a data governance, like understand where your data come from, comply with GDPR, etc. Document everything, any function you create, any data, any process, you have to document that is related with your AI product. Log every event that gets out to it when it is deployed. And also design it in a way that the human can always intervene and has an oversight above these systems. So, like I mentioned, I just want to focus on these 3 points because this is also where we are heavily involved, and this is our bread and butter, basically, that we consulted a lot in the past 5 years and also provide a software solution that helps people exactly with these 3 problems that are now new to these use cases that are classified as a high risk in the European Union. So basically, with our experience for over 5 years, we were heavily involved with safety critical systems, especially in the automotive industry that is highly regulated, also in government or in telecommunication where discrimination is a huge topic. One has to have a systematic test strategy that helps you to do exactly what the European Commission is asking for in these regulations. So in a test strategy, you have to define quality requirements, and all of these points I will just dive in very quickly. But bear with me, I squeezed a 30-minute presentation into a 15-minute one, so I might have to skip the last point. And you have to have a test approach that systematically tests all the relevant scenarios and ensures that human dignity or a human life is not in danger. And if you find a defect while deploying the system, you have to have a concept how you can mitigate this risk and solve this failure and this bug that was introduced in the system. And all of this only makes sense if it's really automated, because every human in the loop here can cause another failure, and then you have to have an argument again why you mitigated this risk of a human making decisions in this automated process. So, in the quality requirements section, basically also what is mentioned in the AI Act, you have to define a statistical confidence where you can understand not only how high your system performs, but also with which confidence you can say that this system is performing in the real world with this performance, and define a statistical threshold and confidence value to it. Select data and severity metrics. So basically, when you want to deploy a system in the field and in the real world, you will be always confronted with noise that might not have happened in your training procedure, but you want to deploy it in the real world, you want to deploy it in a safety critical or high risk use case. So one has to understand how does noise look like, how big is it, and how severe consequences does it have. And for being sure that you covered all the use cases, you also have to define the relevant scenarios that your system might be confronted with, and you have to have a risk mitigation system against it, and define quality thresholds that are either given by some technical standard or reflect the risks that you are willing to take to the system, and then test every relevant scenario against it. So these are basically the quality requirements one has to define beforehand before you can even start deploying or testing these systems. And then if you're proceeding to the test approach, I just want to focus on one point and want to stress one topic very deeply, because performance measures, that is like basically what every ML developer is doing, testing against performance, how well does the system performs, is not enough for safety critical systems. And I just want to explain you why this is and how you will overcome this. So basically, and please excuse me, I have to use a few formulas, but I try to also explain them in a way that they might not be too difficult. So basically, in your data set, you have data points that are covering 99% of all the cases that are happening in your training set. And it is, they're just, I call them clean data points. But then there's one tiny amount of edge cases, I call it here the dirty data, that is very rare. You might not be concerned with it, and it's maybe not important, but they could lead to severe consequences. But measuring performance is like not important, and I will show you why. Because this dirty data, this 1% or maybe even slower, has a way lesser probability of exposure than this clean data, the 99% that is happening in your training set. So basically, if you're measuring performance, you're just having a metric that is basically measuring the average around all your data points, how well the system performs on average on all your data points. So what happens now is you basically find a decision boundary for all these points that happen all the time, but you totally forget and you don't have to be concerned with it because you don't really measure it, because it's just the average value of your performance and you don't have to be concerned with this little data point. And this is basically how a normal AI use case works, and this is how performance can be measured for entertainment purposes. But this tiny data point could lead to severe consequences that violate either human health or human dignity. So when you're concerned with the high-risk applications, you have to change this, and you have to measure differently, because performance is not sufficient, because you're not really training your system to learn also on rare data points. So it is important to measure risk and not performance. And what is risk? So risk is basically severity times exposure. So how often does something happen and how bad is it actually? How high are the consequences of this data point or in general? So now we see that even a data point that is really rare and an edge case that has high consequences still is considered to be high risk. It can be considered high risk. So this also has to be considered if you are deploying in a high risk application. So like I mentioned, performance does not cover this. Basically, performance only measures the average, and rare data points are not important for the performance measure. So one has to change it to severity measures that are basically, if you are, like we did in the quality requirements, identifying the relevant scenarios and providing enough data points and measure these, then these whole decision boundary changes, and you have to be concerned with all these tiny data points such that severe consequences cannot happen. But this now in this graphic looks very, very easy, but I skipped exactly the part where it's getting complicated. And this are exactly how do I get to these hazards and how do I get to these threats, because they are apparently very rare and thus extremely expensive to cover and collect in the real world. So the community and also different committees thought about test strategies and test methods one can use to also measure this risk of these rare data points and rather capture this relationship between the real data and this training data that is just basically a laboratory condition. And also on top, what I don't want to focus on here is security is also seen very, very new threats. So also there are huge communities where also cybersecurity is a new topic. Here are also very rare data points of somebody who can craft and change and manipulate one data point and cause severe consequences. But yeah, different committees are now sitting together and trying to define test methods and strategies and approaches to go against this. And some of these are basically like corruptions that are giving an overlay over real data and simulating rare conditions like weather conditions like rain and snow and also sensor noise and so on. And also capturing adversarial attacks where an attacker is really trying to find a malicious data point and inject it into a system to get some benefits out of it. For example, in a credit scoring system, this could be very beneficial for an attacker. So I'm seeing my time is running up. I will just barely mention how one is conducting a defect triage. So first of all, we saw performance measures are not sufficient, so one has to think about how can I measure risk in the end, and test this risk measure against any relevant scenarios that might spontaneously happen in the field, and evaluate if the quality requirements I mentioned in the first point are met, and minimize this risk by updating the architecture, changing the training procedure, using these test methods I showed to aggregate the data, augment data, collect more data points, and then test again until you make it. And this is highly complex, and a lot of people are also getting to us trying to solve this issue. It is really highly complex, and I cannot go into detail here. But this is what one has to solve when the AI Act is coming out, when it's getting mandatory, and when you are in a high-risk application that is essentially falling under new regulations. So I have to skip the automation strategy, but I'm very happy to talk to you about it, because this is basically our bread and butter and our software that basically sits directly in the MLOps life cycle, where the data processing, the ML development and training happens. We are sitting exactly where the validation is. We are providing test methods, we are providing data, we're providing approaches to mitigate this risk automatically and get you to the point where you can make it in the end, even if it's very difficult. So 8 it till you make it, and if you have any questions, I'm very willing to answer now in the Q&A, and also I will be around here anyways.
Thank you very much, and also thanks for quite successfully squeezing the 30-minute presentation into our 20-minute time slot. We unfortunately, as you said, don't have time for Q&A on stage, but you'll stick around, so if there are follow-up questions, feel free to approach him afterwards.